Mazda has been moving into luxury territory recently, and this all-new CX-70 is no exception. But can the brand keep up with rivals like Lexus, Audi, Infiniti, and Acura? To find out, we grabbed another recent luxury striver, the Genesis GV80, to see whether the Mazda can keep up with the big boys. What's up, folks? I'm Dave Underkoffler, Head of Consumer Insights for CarGurus. Today, we're taking a look at two of the newer faces in the premium crossover segment to see how each stacks up against more established brands. On my right, we have the first ever Mazda CX-70, which is essentially the same as the CX-90, except this has only 2 rows of seats on the inside. And on my left is the Genesis GV80. First introduced by Hyundai's luxury brand back in 2021, this model has been refreshed for 2025. And while there is a bit of a price difference between these two testers, they do have a lot in common. They both pack turbocharged 6-cylinder engines under the hood, head-turning styling inside and out, and full-time all-wheel drive. So how do these two new challengers stack up against each other and the rest of the ultra-competitive luxury crossover segment? Let's go spend some time with them and find out. But before you do, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel so you can get alerts on all of our future updates. All right, let's start by taking a look at the exterior of these two vehicles. First, the Mazda. As you can see, it's definitely a sportier look. There's really no chrome on the outside at all. You do have these really nice rims. I like those, but most of the trim is blacked out. So again, definitely a sportier profile. In terms of dimensions, this Mazda is about 5 inches longer than the Genesis, and the wheelbase is about 6 inches longer. But overall, the width and the height are about the same. In terms of pricing, this Mazda starts at about $42,000, including destination, and goes all the way up to about $58,000 for the fully loaded version you see here. Turning to the Genesis, as I mentioned, this was updated for 2025. Most of those changes actually were made to the interior. The exterior, they're actually pretty minimal, but they did include revising this grille. You also have some small changes to these headlights, and then the lower fascia down below has also been redesigned. But overall, it still maintains the GV80's old school luxury approach with lots of chrome, big rims on the side. And if you're thinking this looks a little bit like Bentley's Bentayga SUV, that's not a coincidence. The designer of Genesis actually used to work at Bentley. Turning to the side, again, here you can see the Genesis is much more bold and brash in its approach to luxury. There's more chrome. You've got these big 22-inch alloy wheels and then large chrome strip down here. In terms of pricing, this starts at about $60,000, including destination, and goes all the way up to an eye-watering 81 grand for the fully loaded version we're testing today. All right, let's take a look at powertrains. As I mentioned, we're testing a fully loaded CX-70, so that means it has an inline 6-cylinder turbocharged engine with a mild hybrid system that gives you 340 total horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque. That's mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission and full-time all-wheel drive. Base models have this same engine that's actually been detuned for less horsepower and torque, while you still get the 8-speed automatic transmission and that all-wheel drive system. Turning to the Genesis side, this loaded GV80 has a 3.5-liter twin turbocharged V6 engine that makes 375 horsepower and 391 pound-feet of torque. It's paired with an 8-speed automatic transmission and full-time all-wheel drive. You can get on base models a 4-cylinder version. That's a 2.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder that makes 300 horsepower and 311 pound-feet of torque. All right, now turning to the interiors, and this is one of the bigger areas where you're gonna see a difference between this Mazda and the Genesis. This Mazda is certainly nice. It's moving into the realm of Acura or Lexus, but that Genesis almost feels like you're in a Bentley. So we'll get to that in a minute. But here, a lot of nice things Mazda is doing. First of all, the materials are really cool. You've got this suede part of the dashboard right here. You've got some brushed metal throughout the cabin. We also have suede inserts on the seats, so that's really comfortable. All CX-70 models do come with leather seats. On our fully loaded version, they are heated and cooled up front, so that's pretty cool. Another thing all CX-70 models get as standard is a 12.3-inch screen here. Our fully loaded tester also has a 12.3-inch digital instrument panel. This has wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto. It is a touchscreen, but it's also not a touchscreen. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not a touchscreen when you've got it in the normal modes, right? So I've got the navigation system up here. No matter what I touch, nothing's going to work. But if I put it into Apple CarPlay, so now it's in CarPlay, now it is a touchscreen and operates like you would expect it to. So that's a little bit of a disconnect. Takes a little getting used to knowing when you can actually use the touchscreen. But no matter, you do have the rotary controller down here. So that's a nice bit of redundancy. Another thing I really like, physical buttons down here. If you've seen our videos before, you know it drives me crazy when everything is integrated either into the screens or it's all touchscreen buttons or haptic buttons. I really like the physical buttons down here. Very easy to find exactly what you're looking for. Our loaded tester also has some really nice tech goodies built into it. You've got wireless smartphone charging down here. We've got a pair of USB-C charge ports in this console. We have a 360-degree camera that's super handy for parking. There's a Bose surround sound audio system and a panoramic moonroof. All right, now let's take a look at the inside of this Genesis. And this is one of the main areas you're gonna see a difference between this GV80 and the Mazda. This is true luxury, whereas the Mazda is sort of premium, right? It's getting into maybe the Acura or the Infiniti territory. This GV80 is firmly in the realm of Mercedes-Benz or BMW or even maybe a cut rate Bentley. Another thing I mentioned is that for 2025, Genesis made some big updates to this GV80, and this is where you're gonna see them primarily. The biggest thing you're gonna notice is this screen. This is now a one-piece screen. It's 27 inches in total width. It used to just sort of have a pop-up screen there and then a separate one here. So they've redesigned that. I really like this layout. They've also completely redesigned this console, right? They've gotten rid of some of the buttons that were down below. They've redesigned this. And what I like is that it's a really nice mix of physical buttons and then also some haptic controls. So you've got a rotary knob here. This is also a touchscreen, so you've got that redundancy. That's pretty cool. But then this is a screen for most of the climate control functions. You do have physical knobs for the temperature and then physical knobs for both the volume and the tuning. So it's a really nice mix. This screen, very premium, but also really responds well to your inputs. I like that. The user interface isn't great on this screen. It's missing some of the functionality maybe you would hope for. So that's a little frustrating. And another thing that's been driving me nuts, I've had this car for a week. It says that this is supposed to have wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto. I have never been able to get it to wirelessly connect to CarPlay via my phone. I tried my wife's phone. None of them was working. So that's been frustrating, especially on a car that's $81,000. So maybe it's just this tester, but do make sure it connects if that's important to you. Another nitpick I have about this interior are these two knobs, right? So you've got the rotary controller for the infotainment system, and then right below it, a very similar rotary controller for the shifter. This is actually what puts the car in drive or in park. More than once, I have reached for one and turned the other. That gets a little frustrating, especially if you're trying to turn the car around in a quick parking lot. I've used this knob by accident plenty of times, so that gets a little frustrating. Not a deal breaker, but it does take some getting used to. Otherwise, the rest of the cabin is phenomenal. Everything you touch is high grade quality. It's a luxurious experience. All of this leather, really nice stitching. You've got the diamond pattern here. These are heated and cooled Napa leather seats up front and in the second row. I really like this trim. You can get wood trim here, but this is a really sort of cool patterned look. It's modern and contemporary without being too flashy or weird. You've got a stitched leather dashboard up above. You also have a Bang & Olufsen sound system. There are speakers absolutely everywhere in this cabin. They're in the doors, they're under the seats. You've got this suede headliner. Just everywhere you look and touch, you get the sense that this is a true luxury vehicle. There's really no shortcuts that Genesis has taken. In terms of interior dimensions, the Mazda and the Genesis are pretty close to one another when it comes to legroom or headroom. There is a bit less cargo room in this Genesis than there is on the Mazda. Another thing I want to point out, you can get a third row of seats on this Genesis. Our fully loaded tester doesn't have it, but it's probably just as well. It really doesn't give you a lot of room, especially not for adults. If you want a third row of seats in the Mazda, remember that's actually the CX-90, the exact same vehicle overall, just with that extra row of seats. Next up, driving impressions, and we're going to start off in the Mazda. And if you know anything about Mazda, you know that for years, the company has been really good about giving all of its vehicles, no matter what vehicle type, giving all of its vehicles a really fun to drive quality. And this CX-70 is no different. Look, no one buys a crossover, obviously, for its handling, for it to drive like a sports car, but it's a nice sort of add-on to this vehicle that it's fun, it's engaging to drive on a daily basis. The steering has a really nice weight to it. The suspension is nicely controlled. You just have a nice sense of where the car is on the road at all times, so I really appreciate that. It's definitely sportier than many other rivals you're going to find in the luxury crossover space, and certainly more sporty than the Genesis. We'll get to that a little bit later. So overall, the driving experience is really nice. Another thing that I like is, yes, it's sporty, but it's not sporty at the expense of comfort. Sometimes you find that in other crossovers. The tires are too thin or the suspension is just too rough. This is sort of a jack of all trades, so I'm really enjoying that. It's quiet on the road. The engine has more than enough power. 340 horsepower is plenty. You do need to keep it in sport mode if you're really going to get on it. Otherwise, the transmission can be a little slow to react. But overall, yeah, Mazda has done a really nice job of tuning the CX-70. couple of other things that are nice. Visibility is really good out of this CX-70. That's not always the case these days as crossovers get more streamlined and more aerodynamic. Sometimes it's actually harder to see out of them. But this A-pillar right here is pretty thin. That's kind of nice. B-pillar is getting a little thicker, but great visibility at the back. So again, that gives you a really nice sense of where the car is on the road at all times. I do like that. And then the seats, really nice seats in this Mazda. Good bolstering without being too firm. They're not quite as good as the ones in the Genesis, but $20,000 difference, I think that's okay. But yeah, overall, this Mazda is ready for a long road trip with the entire family in it. All right, now we're in the Genesis, and this is another area, much like the interior, where you truly feel the difference between this and the Mazda. And you would hope so, right? For, again, that $20,000 difference. This feels every bit like a true luxury SUV or crossover. I've actually had the good fortune of driving the Bentley Bentayga, that's the big SUV from Bentley, and this Genesis feels remarkably similar to that. Everything about this ride is very heavy, it's very purposeful, it's very sort of old school luxury. It's going to drive more close to like a Mercedes-Benz than anything else that's going to be more sporty in this segment. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of luxury buyers are looking for purposeful comfort. So that means that this Genesis, it's not going to feel the sportiest. It doesn't feel the lightest on its feet. The steering feels a little heavy. Overall, the whole vehicle feels kind of heavy as it goes around turns, but heavy in a good way, in a solid luxury way. The suspension is really nicely tuned. Again, doesn't feel sporty, but it soaks up the road really nicely. We're on a pretty rough road right now. You wouldn't know it. And again, we've got really big wheels and tires on this package. Sometimes that erodes some of the ride quality, but not so in here. Very supple, very soft. Really not a lot of body roll, even though it does feel kind of heavy. So yeah, this is a pretty impressive experience. And again, fundamentally different than the Mazda, which feels, yes, upscale, but not true luxury. This is true luxury. Meanwhile, the powertrain certainly feels pretty stout in this vehicle. There's a little bit of turbo lag from a dead stop, but once the vehicle has a little momentum and you get on it, this thing absolutely flies. And that's in normal mode. If you put it in a sport mode, it gets that much more aggressive and eager, so that's pretty cool. The brakes feel pretty good. The seats are fantastic in this Genesis. As I mentioned, they're good in the Mazda, but here, again, this is true luxury, really nice bolstering. We actually, in this fully loaded version, have active bolstering, so depending on which mode or what speed you're traveling at, the bolsters will actually inflate to give you more support. So that's a pretty cool trick. I think Mercedes was actually the first brand to pull that off. Finally, visibility. It's pretty good in this Genesis. This A-pillar is pretty thin. B-pillar is about average, and then you can see really well out the back. But overall, I'm really impressed with the luxury chops of this Genesis. That's something that an automaker really can't fake. They've got to build the vehicle well to achieve it, and Genesis definitely has. All right, folks, there you have it. Our look at two of the more recent challengers in the premium crossover space. On one end of the pricing spectrum, you've got the Mazda CX-70. We really like the styling inside and out in this vehicle and the handling. It's actually surprisingly engaging to drive for a crossover. But then there are some cons. We don't love the user interface on the infotainment system since it leaves a lot to be desired. We also just wonder why Mazda didn't call this the CX-90 because it's basically what it is without that third row. And finally, the build quality in the CX-70, while good, isn't quite up to par with something like an Acura or a Lexus. So that's just something to consider. And then on the other end of the spectrum is this Genesis GV80. Yes, it costs tens of thousands of dollars more than this Mazda, but you absolutely get a lot more for that money. The interior experience is pretty remarkable, and we really like the powertrain under here when it's in the right mode. It does have some cons, however. $81,000 does still feel a little high, even considering all of the amenities that you get. And we do wish that it were a little more fun to drive, although we can certainly understand that this is going to appeal to a lot of buyers as is. But overall, each of these models brings a lot to the luxury crossover space, and depending on your budget, you should definitely consider either one of them. So for reviews or listings of either of these models or anything else you're shopping for, new or used, be sure to check out the newly redesigned CarGurus.com. And before you go, like and subscribe to this channel so you can get alerts on all of our future updates. We'll see you out there.